You ever think about the person living next door to you? Like, have you actually thought about who they are? Where they go? What they do when nobody's watching? Most of us don't. We wave. We make small talk about the weather. We assume we know enough. But what if I told you that sometimes the most dangerous person you'll ever meet is the one you trust the most? The one who shows up to your community events. The one who entertains your kids. The one who seems to have it all figured out. Between 1972 and 1978, one man in suburban Chicago murdered at least 33 young men and boys. His name was John Wayne Gacy. And for 6 years, he operated almost completely undetected. He had a successful business. He was beloved in his community. He was a beloved entertainer. But he was also systematically abducting, torturing, and killing teenagers in the basement of his own home. And here's the thing that keeps me up at night. It almost could have stopped earlier. Way earlier. But a series of failures, oversights, and miscommunications allowed one of America's most prolific serial killers to keep hunting. This is the story of how John Wayne Gacy evaded justice for 6 years. And more importantly, it's the story of the investigation that finally caught him. So who was John Wayne Gacy? And how did he become someone capable of doing what he did? He was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago. His father was an auto mechanic. His mother was a homemaker. By all accounts, it looked like a normal American family. But childhood for John Wayne Gacy was anything but normal. His father was an alcoholic. And not just a drinker. A brutal, controlling man who used fear as his primary parenting tool. He would beat his son. He would verbally abuse him. He called him names. He compared him unfavorably to his sisters. Can you imagine growing up hearing your own father tell you that you're not good enough? That you're dumb and stupid? That you'll probably grow up to be queer? By the time Gacy was a teenager, he'd developed a heart condition. He was hospitalized repeatedly. He experienced blackouts. His grades suffered. And through it all, his father accused him of faking it, of being weak, of not being man enough. What kind of damage does that do to a kid? What happens when the person who's supposed to protect you is the person hurting you the most? At 18, Gacy decided he was done. Done with his father. Done with Chicago. He took what little money he had and drove to Las Vegas. In Vegas, he worked as a mortuary attendant. And here's where it gets strange. One evening when he was alone in the mortuary, Gacy climbed into a coffin. He embraced a young male corpse. He caressed it. And something in that moment, something dark and broken, awakened inside him. When he returned to Chicago, everything changed. He became ambitious. He became charming. He became the kind of guy who could work his way up. He took business classes. He got a job with a shoe company. He married a woman named Marlyn Myers. Her father owned Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa. Gacy got the job managing them. On the surface, he was a success story. A guy who pulled himself up from a difficult childhood and made something of himself. His father even apologized to him. Can you believe that? After all those years of abuse, his father finally told him he was wrong. He said, "Son, I was wrong about you." That's the moment Gacy said he felt he'd finally made it. Finally proved something. Finally was good enough. But there was another side to this success. Hidden side. While managing those KFC restaurants in Waterloo, Gacy became deeply involved in the JCs, the Junior Chamber of Commerce. He was a solid member. He fundraised. He volunteered. He was named the outstanding vice president. But in the basement of those restaurants, Gacy was running what he called a club, place where employees could drink. A place where he socialized exclusively with teenage boys. And a place where sexual abuse was happening. Gacy would give these kids alcohol. He would make sexual advances. If they refused, he'd laugh it off. He'd say it was a joke, a test of their morals. But it wasn't. It was predation. It was grooming. And it worked. In 1967, Gacy sexually assaulted a 15-year-old boy named Donald Voorhees Jr., the son of a local politician. Fellow JC member. Gacy lured him with promises of showing him adult films. He plied him with alcohol. And then he manipulated him into sexual contact. This wasn't Gacy's first assault. But it was the one that got him caught. Gacy was arrested. He was convicted of sodomy. He received a 10-year sentence. But here's where the first major failure happens. He only served 18 months. 18 months for raping a teenage boy. Think about that. How many other kids could have been protected if he'd served his full sentence? How many lives could have been saved? When Gacy got out of prison in 1969, what do you think happened? Did police monitor him? Did they track a known sex offender moving to a new state? Did anyone warn the community he was moving to? No. None of that happened. Gacy simply moved back to Chicago. He divorced his wife. He started a contracting business. And he began building a new facade. A new respectable life. But the predator underneath never went away. He was just waiting. Just planning. In December 1971, Gacy purchased a ranch-style house in Norwood Park Township, a quiet suburb northwest of Chicago. The address was 8213 West Somerdale Avenue. And that house had a basement, crawl space. A few months later, Gacy married again. This time to a woman named Carol Hoff. Like his first marriage, this was a performance. A way to look normal. To blend in. To hide. By 1975, Gacy had started dressing up as a clown. He called himself Pogo. He performed at children's birthday parties, community events, charitable fundraisers. Parents loved him. Kids loved him. He was entertaining, funny, seemingly harmless. But here's what I want you to think about. What would it take for you to not recognize a predator? What would it take for someone to operate right in front of you, entertaining your children, while committing some of the worst crimes imaginable? Because that's what was happening. And nobody suspected a thing. On January 2, 1972, Gacy committed his first known murder. We don't even know the victim's name. That's how invisible some of these young men were. The method was always the same. Gacy would approach vulnerable young men, often teenagers, often from troubled backgrounds. He'd offer them work. He'd offer them money. He'd offer them friendship. He'd invite them back to his house. Once inside, he'd show them a pair of handcuffs. He'd say he was demonstrating a magic trick. He'd ask them to put them on. And once those cuffs were locked, there was no escape. What happened next was brutal. Torture. And then death by asphyxiation or strangulation. But here's what I need you to understand. Gacy wasn't some wild animal acting on impulse. He was methodical. He was calculating. He understood what he was doing. He knew it was wrong. But he did it anyway. Again and again and again. And when it was over, when his victim was dead, Gacy had to figure out what to do with the body. At first, he buried them in the crawl space beneath his house. 26 victims ended up there. Buried in shallow graves in the darkness. Rotting. Decomposing. As the years went on and the bodies accumulated, the crawl space became full. So Gacy adapted. 3 more victims were buried elsewhere on his property. And 4 were wrapped and dumped into the Des Plaines River, where they floated downstream, bloating in the water. By 1976, after his divorce from Carol, something shifted. The frequency of killings accelerated. He wasn't hunting occasionally anymore. He was hunting constantly. In just 2 years, 1976 and 1977, he murdered at least 30 young men. Think about what that means. That's almost one per week. One person per week disappearing into that basement. One person per week being tortured to death. One person per week being buried or dumped. And his neighbors. They had no idea. His ex-wives. They had no idea. His friends who came to his poolside parties. They had no idea. They were standing on top of graves and didn't even know it. By 1978, Chicago and its suburbs were gripped by a creeping horror. Young men were vanishing. Not in ones or twos but in dozens. They'd go out and never come home. Their families would report them missing. Police files would grow thicker. But without bodies, without evidence, the cases would go cold. Can you imagine being that parent? That sibling? Calling the police. Filing reports. Desperately hoping for news. And then, nothing. Just an empty room. Just unanswered questions. Here's the thing about this period. Police weren't connecting the cases. Why? Because the young men were disappearing from different areas. They were different ages. They came from different backgrounds. There was no obvious pattern. At least, not to the police who were looking. Gacy was the pattern. But nobody realized it yet. On December 13, 1978, a 15-year-old boy named Robert Piest disappeared from a pharmacy where he worked in Des Plaines, Illinois. Robert was a good kid, honor student, had a job, had a family who loved him, had plans for his future. That afternoon, he told his mother that someone had approached him about a construction job. He said he'd be back soon. He wanted to get information. Robert Piest never came home. His parents immediately reported him missing. And that's when Detective Joseph Kozenzak of the Des Plaines Police Department got involved. And here's what's interesting. Kozenzak didn't just file the report and move on. He actually investigated. The pharmacy employee remembered the man who'd talked to Robert. Middle-aged, heavy-set, balding. His name was John Wayne Gacy. When police ran his name, red flags appeared immediately. He had a prior conviction for sodomy. In Iowa. Years ago. Why hadn't that been on anyone's radar when he moved to? Detectives located Gacy and brought him in for questioning. He was calm, in control. He admitted knowing Robert. He said the boy had come to his house. But nothing happened, he claimed. Robert had tried to steal from him, so he'd kicked him out. That was it. But something about Gacy didn't sit right with detectives. So they obtained a search warrant for his house. On December 21, 1978, 8 days after Robert disappeared, police arrived at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue. They descended into the basement. They opened the crawl space. And they found hell. The smell hit them first. So overwhelming that officers became physically ill. And then they saw them. Bodies. Skeletal remains. Decomposed flesh. 26 young men and boys. Packed into the darkness like garbage. 26. One detective would later describe it as the worst thing he'd ever seen. 26 victims buried under a suburban home. While the owner lived upstairs. While he hosted parties. While he mowed the lawn. While he went to work. How is that possible? How does something like that stay hidden? As the full scope of the discovery became clear, Gacy's facade finally cracked. On December 22, 1978, he confessed. He confessed to killing over 24 people. And then he kept going. He confessed to more. And more. In the end, Gacy admitted to 33 murders. 33 human beings. Some he remembered by name. Others he couldn't recall. He'd killed so many that he'd lost track. Police found bodies in the Des Plaines River. They found graves on his property. With each discovery, the number grew. And with each confession, Gacy provided details. He talked about his methods. He explained how he lured his victims. He described what he did to them. And here's what's chilling. He wasn't insane. He wasn't delusional. He knew exactly what he was doing. He understood right from wrong. He simply didn't care. There was no remorse, no regret, just a clinical, methodical recounting of murders, as if he were describing a business transaction. After Gacy was arrested, police and investigators started asking themselves tough questions. How did this happen? How did one man operate for 6 years in a suburb and kill 33 people? What failed? And the answers were uncomfortable. First, the criminal justice system failed. Gacy served 18 months of a 10-year sentence for sodomy. Why? How does that happen? If he'd served his full time, he never would have been in Illinois. He never would have met Robert Piest. How many lives could have been saved? Second, interstate communication failed. Gacy had a prior conviction in Iowa, but when he moved to Illinois, there was no system in place to alert authorities. No tracking of sex offenders. No warning to the community. Should that have existed? Absolutely. Third, police didn't connect the dots. Young men were disappearing across different jurisdictions, but nobody was comparing notes. Nobody was seeing the pattern. Different police departments weren't communicating with each other. And that allowed Gacy to keep hunting. Fourth, Gacy's public persona was so convincing that nobody suspected him. He was a successful businessman, community volunteer, an entertainer, a guy who seemed to have it all together. And that made him invisible. That made him untouchable. The Gacy case changed everything. It became a watershed moment for law enforcement. Suddenly, police departments across the country realized they needed better systems, better communication, better coordination. In the years after Gacy's arrest, multi-jurisdictional task forces became standard practice for investigating serial crimes. Police departments started sharing information more effectively. They developed better protocols for tracking sex offenders across state lines. They created centralized databases. Would those systems have caught Gacy earlier if they'd existed during his active years? Probably. Possibly. We'll never know for sure. But they exist now because of what happened. Gacy's trial began in February 1980. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. 33 counts of murder. The remains of his victims. His confessions. His detailed descriptions of the crimes. The defense argued insanity. They brought in expert witnesses. They tried to convince the jury that Gacy's abusive childhood, his complicated relationship with sexuality, some undiagnosed mental condition, maybe all of that made him not responsible for his actions. But here's the thing, the jury didn't buy it. Because Gacy's actions showed planning. They showed control. They showed a man who understood right from wrong but chose to do wrong anyway. That's not insanity. That's evil. The jury found him guilty on all 33 counts. At that time, it was the most homicides committed by a single individual in United States legal history. 33 murders. A new record. And the jury recommended death. Gacy was sentenced to death on March 13, 1980. But here's where the American legal system grinds slowly. He was remanded to Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois to await execution. And then he waited, and waited, and waited. 14 years on death row. 14 years of appeals. 14 years of exhausting every legal avenue. And during those 14 years, Gacy became a morbid celebrity. He corresponded with journalists and filmmakers. He painted pictures. He gave interviews. Think about that. He became famous. Infamous, sure, but still famous. He achieved a kind of celebrity. Is that justice? Is that what should happen to someone who murdered 33 people? Here's what we need to remember. While Gacy was waiting on death row, becoming a curiosity for true crime enthusiasts, there were 33 families out there dealing with loss, with grief, with the knowledge that their loved one had been tortured to death and buried in someone's basement. Robert Piest, Genvi, Gregory Godzik, Michael Marino, Kenneth Parker, Michael Odell, Daryl Sampson, James Hawkinson, and 25 others whose names deserve to be spoken and remembered. These weren't characters in a crime story. They were real people. They had dreams. They had families. They had futures that were stolen from them. Some of them came from stable homes. Some were runaways. Some were vulnerable. But all of them died in terror and agony. All of them were violated. All of them were erased. On May 10, 1994, 16 years after his arrest, John Wayne Gacy received his final meal. Fried chicken and potato chips. The same food he'd served so many times before. As evening fell, witnesses gathered in the execution chamber at Stateville Correctional Center. Gacy was led in. He was strapped to the execution table. And 4 was inserted. Guards read his crimes. He was given an opportunity for final words. His last statement. He claimed he was innocent. He blamed others. He expressed no remorse for the young men whose lives he'd stolen. Even facing death, he couldn't accept responsibility. At 12:34 a.m., lethal injection was administered. His heart stopped, and the story of the killer clown came to an end. In 1979, Gacy's house was demolished. The crawlspace where he'd buried 26 of his victims was erased from the physical landscape. But the memory remained. The psychological impact remained. The horror remained. And the lessons learned. Those remained too. The Gacy case highlighted critical failures in the American criminal justice system. Failures in communication. Failures in tracking sex offenders. Failures in law enforcement coordination. And because of those failures, procedures changed. Police departments learned how to recognize serial killers. They learned how to connect cases across jurisdictions. They learned the importance of sharing information. They developed better investigative techniques. In a tragic way, the 33 young men who died at Gacy's hands contributed to a system that would help protect others from similar predators in the future. Is that justice? Does it matter? Does it bring them back? No. But maybe it prevents other families from experiencing the same loss. In the decades since Gacy's execution, criminal psychologists and investigators have continued to study his case. They've tried to answer impossible questions. What creates a serial killer? Is it nature or nurture? Was it his father's abuse? Was it something born into him? Gacy himself claimed that his childhood made him who he was. That his father's abuse, the sexual molestation, the trauma, all of it created him. But here's the problem with that explanation. Millions of people suffer abuse. Millions experience trauma. And they don't become killers. So what was the missing piece for Gacy? Was it intelligence combined with a complete absence of empathy? Was it his ability to compartmentalize? To live 2 completely separate lives without apparent psychological strain? Or was it simply that he chose evil? That at every crossroads, at every moment where he could have sought help, He instead chose to pursue his darkest impulses. One of the most unsettling aspects of Gacy's case is something that applies to many serial killers: his ability to function in normal society. He worked, he married, he socialized, he was liked and respected. To his neighbors and colleagues, he appeared to be a normal, functioning member of society. But in private, he was committing some of the most horrific crimes imaginable. This duality, the ability to live two completely separate lives, is one of the defining characteristics of many serial killers. They're not mad in the traditional sense. They don't hear voices. They don't have hallucinations. They understand right and wrong. But they have no empathy. They don't experience the moral restraint that prevents most people from harming others. To them, other people are objects, playthings, disposable. Gacy felt superior to his victims. He believed he was using them, controlling them, destroying them. The power was intoxicating. It was the ultimate high. And he indulged in it for 6 years with near total impunity. Here's the question that I think about. What if Gacy had served his full 10-year sentence in Iowa? What if someone had been tracking him when he moved to Illinois? What if police had connected the disappearances earlier? We know that Robert Piest's disappearance led to Gacy's arrest. But how many other young men disappeared between the time Gacy was released from prison and the time Piest went missing? How many could have been saved with better systems, better communication, better oversight? The answer is we don't know. But it's more than 0. It's probably more than 1. Might be more than 10. And that's what haunts me about this case. Not just the murders that happened, but the ones that didn't have to. The failures that allowed a predator to hunt for so long, in broad daylight, hiding in plain sight. John Wayne Gacy was executed on May 10, 1994. 33 young men never came home. 33 families never got answers for years. 33 lives were stolen by one man in a quiet suburb in Illinois. And here's what I want you to take away from this. Evil isn't always recognizable. Doesn't always look like what you expect. Sometimes it looks like your neighbor. Sometimes it looks like the guy who entertains your kids. Sometimes it looks perfectly normal. The Gacy case forced America to ask hard questions about how we investigate crimes, how we track offenders, how we communicate across jurisdictions. And it forced us to confront the reality that the systems we rely on to protect us are imperfect. They can fail. They do fail. But knowing our vulnerabilities, gives us a chance to do better. To protect ourselves and our communities more effectively. 33 young men died so that we could learn those lessons. Their names were Robert Piest, John Gacy, Gregory Godzik, Michael Marino, Kenneth Parker, Michael Odell, Daryl Sampson, James Hawkinson, and 25 others. They deserve to be remembered. Not as statistics, not as plot points in a crime story, but as human beings whose lives mattered.